2014 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture. My name is Peter Boyce, and it is my pleasant duty to open tonight's proceedings, which are jointly sponsored by the University of Tasmania, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. The Vice-Chancellor is, of course, our grand host, but a bit like Julius Caesar's Roman Gaul, we have divided the introductory speaking parts into three. The audience can rest assured, however, that we do eventually invite our distinguished speaker to take the stand. We extend a warm welcome to Miss Kathleen Plimsoll and members of her immediate family, and to four members of the state's Honorary Consular Corps: Mrs. Diane Bai, representing France and Germany; Dr. Eva Meidel, representing Austria; Dr. Alexios Pittas, Greece; and Ms. Jenny Ellen Kennedy, Norway. We also welcome the presence of the Australian Institute of International Affairs National Vice President, Ms. Zara Kimpton. In accordance with university practice, we acknowledge the Muhunina people as traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which this campus was built, and we pay respect to their elders, past and present. In a moment, the Vice-Chancellor will remind us of the significance of Sir James Plimsoll's achievements, but I hope he will indulge me a brief autobiographical remark. Sir James was my first ever boss during a short period of employment at External Affairs in the late 1950s, and he continued throughout my academic career as a mentor, regularly agreeing to speak to my senior students whenever he visited the campus I happened to be working in. So it is with particular enthusiasm that I introduce the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Rathjen, to profile Plimsoll's career, both as diplomat and governor of the state. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice-Chancellor.
Thanks, Peter, and can I say what a pleasure it is to welcome you all here tonight for the Sir James Plimsoll Annual Lecture. It's funny how themes recur. It's only yesterday that I actually heard something else about Roman Gaul. I was speaking with some major political leaders in Canberra about the regionality of Tasmania and how that might impact us with higher education deregulation. And they made the comment that Roman Gaul was fractured, but it had nothing on Hobart, Launceston and Burnie. At the Patrons' Dinner of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2005, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Downer, announced that the Department of Foreign Affairs would sponsor an annual Sir James Plimsoll Lecture featuring an Australian or international authority on international relations. It was agreed that the University of Tasmania would host the annual event in collaboration with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. This lecture is part of the university's program of thought leadership, which includes and extends beyond the exchange of ideas within the academy. We have a deep commitment to stimulate and facilitate the practice of public debate and discussion, and to share with the wider Tasmanian community some of the distinguished speakers that visit our beautiful island. Can I just say on that note, thank you for giving up your time to be with us tonight. What we look for in our audience is a spectrum of Tasmanian society. We don't want to preach only to those at the University of Tasmania. We don't only want to speak to those of a particular age cohort. We like to see Tasmanian society and the community in all its glory come to join us, and around the room tonight it is clear that that is what has happened. Through their inspiring and challenging presentations, those who have delivered the James Plimsoll Lecture have made a significant contribution to the profile of the university as a leader in contemporary thinking, and have helped to build and enhance relationships within the community and across the globe. Sir James Plimsoll was one of the most distinguished diplomats in the history of Australia's Department of External Affairs, later the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Having completed bachelor's degrees in economics and arts at the University of Sydney, and after serving in the Australian Imperial Force in the Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs, Sir James was appointed to the Far Eastern Commission tasked with overseeing the Allied Council for Japan during the occupation of that country. In 1950, he was sent as the Australian representative to the United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea. Later, Sir James was appointed as Australia's permanent representative to the United Nations in 1959 and became Australia's High Commissioner to India and Ambassador to Nepal in 1962. He was chosen to be head of the Department of External Affairs in 1965. In 1970, Sir James was appointed as Ambassador to the United States and 4 years later as Ambassador to the USSR. Subsequently, he was also to serve as Ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and the EEC and High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. His final diplomatic post was as Ambassador to Japan in 1981 and 1982. Sir James later became a highly popular and respected Governor of Tasmania from 1982 until his death in May 1987. That's an extraordinary career, but it may have been very different. In 1947, while he was based in the USA, Sir James received a letter from Torlev Hitton, who was economic advisor to the Bank of New South Wales, advising of a vacancy for the position of Professor of Economics at the University of Tasmania. Hitton encouraged Sir James to apply, which he did, and we turned him down. As a second prize, he became First Secretary of the Department of External Affairs. I'll just say, actually, we had a seminar in this room some months ago. Ross Garneau came to open one of our new institutes for social change, and he made the comment that he thinks of Australia's 4 most distinguished and significant economists, the University of Tasmania, he thought, produced 3 of them. We've been very interested because we've just digitised the PhD thesis of one of those 3. Despite being unsuccessful in securing a role in the university all those years ago, Sir James developed a great interest in the university when he was Governor of Tasmania, and in early 1987 he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the university not long before he died. He was known around the community because he liked to come in unannounced to browse in the university bookshop. It's fitting, therefore, that the same bookshop, we don't move all that fast, will stock a biography of Sir James written by Jeremy Herder when it is published later this year or early in the new year, and occasionally that will fittingly fall within the university's 125th anniversary, which is next year. And so, now to this evening's lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce Alopi Latukefu, State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has supported the Plimsoll Lecture since its inception. Over the years, a number of ministers and senior officials, including Foreign Ministers Downer and Rudd, and the current Secretary of the Department, Mr. Peter Varghese, have spoken at the Plimsoll, alongside international figures such as Dr. Jose Ramos Horta from Timor-Leste. The Plimsoll Lecture is an important event for the Department, as well as the University of Tasmania and the AIIA. Sir James Plimsoll remains a notable figure in DFAT's institutional history, as much as in Tasmania, where he remains a much admired and revered governor of the state. As the State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Tasmania, it there gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. When he retired from the High Court of Australia on the 2nd of February 2009, Michael Kirby was Australia's longest-serving judge. He was first appointed in 1975 as the Deputy President of the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. Soon after, he was seconded as inaugural Chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission from 1975 to 84. Later, he was appointed a Judge of the Federal Court of Australia, then President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and concurrently President of the Court of Appeal of some Solomon Islands. His appointment to the High Court of Australia came in 1996, where he served 13 years. In later years, he was Acting Chief Justice of Australia twice. In addition to his judicial duties, Michael Kirby has served on 3 university governing boards, being elected Chancellor of Macquarie University in Sydney from 1984 to 93. He also served on many national and international bodies. Amongst the latter has been the service as a member of the World Health Organization's Global Commission on AIDS, as President of the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, and as UN Special Representative of Human Rights in Cambodia, as a member of the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee, as a member of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Judicial Reference Group, and as a member of the UNAIDS Reference Group on HIV and Human Rights. Following his judicial retirement, Michael Kirby was elected President of the Institute of Arbitrators and Mediators Australia from 2009 to 2010. He served as a board member of the Australian Centre for International Commercial Arbitration. In 2010, he was appointed to the Australian panel of the International Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes in the World Bank. He also serves as Editor-in-Chief of the Laws of Australia. He has been appointed Honorary Visiting Professor by 12 universities, and he participates regularly in many local and international conferences and meetings. He has been awarded a number of honorary doctorates at home and abroad. In 2010, Michael Kirby was awarded the Gruber Justice Prize. He served 2011-12 as a member of the Eminent Persons Group investigating the future of the Commonwealth of Nations. He was appointed as a Commissioner of the UNDP Global Commission on HIV and Law in March 2011 and was appointed to the Advisory Council of Transparency International based in Berlin. He was also appointed as a Commissioner of the UNAIDS Commission on moving the AIDS to the right to health from 2013 to 14. In 2013, he was appointed Chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights Violations in North Korea, an important topic on which he will be addressing us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the 2014 Plimsoll Lecturer, the Honourable Michael Kirby.
Vice-Chancellor and distinguished members of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, members of the Plimsoll family, members of the family of supporters of the University of Tasmania, and fellow citizens. It's a great pleasure for me once again to be in the Sir Stanley Burbury Theatre. I remember Sir Stanley as Chief Justice of this state and his wife, Pearl, wonderful personalities, and later he too became the Governor of Tasmania, and it's marvellous that this university has commemorated him in this way, a Chancellor, a Chief Justice and a Governor. And I'm particularly delighted that I have the chance tonight to honour Sir James Plimsoll. He was educated in public schools in New South Wales. He went to the famous Sydney Boys High School, and as we've heard, but for the hand of fate, he might have become an economist. But instead, he reached to higher aspirations to serve the world and the causes of our country and the United Nations, and he became probably the most distinguished, quintessential Australian head of mission, ambassador, as it were, from Central Casting. He held, as we've heard, virtually every top position. It just wouldn't happen today. It wouldn't happen because there are a lot of people who are top ambassadors and they all have legitimate career aspirations, and to get every one of the jewels in the crown was even then a remarkable thing, and today still more astonishing. But Sir James was unique in one particular respect, which I remember well. In the 1970s and 80s, I was serving as the chair of the Australian Law Reform Commission. And as such, I was involved in a lot of activities looking at the boundaries of the law. And one of the activities which we were assigned by Attorney General Ellicott in the Fraser government was to examine the laws on privacy. And so I was sent to Europe because Europe, having come through the Nazi occupation and the misuse of personal information, was very much involved in the effort to get proper protections for individual privacy. If you could do horrible things to people with manila folders, what worse could you do with the newfangled computers and information systems? And so, because the headquarters of the European Commission, as it was then, was in Brussels, I went to Brussels and I received a message that the Australian head of mission there, Sir James Plimsoll, had heard that I was coming to Brussels, and I hadn't informed him that I was coming to Brussels, and that was a very bad career move on my part. But he soon repaired it. He said, well, I happen to have arranged a dinner, a lunch, and an afternoon tea and a reception. It's rather like the University of Tasmania. When you come here to spend a day, you get all of the above. And he said, I would like you to come to be a guest because I believe that when we have Australians passing through, we should give them a chance to meet the locals and the locals to meet them. He was determined to break down the stereotype that Australia was made up only of sporting heroes and legends and other such wonderful and magnificent, but to him not particularly stimulating types. And therefore I was suddenly brought into the inner sanctum of the bureaucracy of what became the European Union. And that was extremely helpful for the work that we were then doing. It was able to bring into the development of Australian law the developments in Europe, and that in turn was accepted by the Federal Parliament with the enactment of the Privacy Act and the development of the principles to protect your privacy and my privacy. And of course it faces new challenges today because of the new technology, but that was the sort of person James Plimsoll was. He didn't just go to the cocktail receptions. He was into substance and into detail, and he wanted to use you. In years that followed, I would sometimes notify people, acutely reprimanded by Sir James, that I hadn't done that to him, and they then rather suggested to me that I was doing that only so that I could get a lift from the airport to the hotel. They didn't have quite the same positive attitude. Some did, and I always said to them, you are an ambassador in the model of Sir James Plimsoll. And those who were told that would always say, you cannot in our department give me a greater compliment. But then when he was appointed the Governor of Tasmania, I would come down here for various legal events, for conferences and so on, and again he heard I was on my way, and so along came the invitation, and he also said, if you would like to bring your partner or your spouse down. So I said, I don't have a spouse, but my mother would love a visit to Government House. This was in a time when, shall we say, the rules were don't ask, don't tell, and therefore I was trying terribly, desperately, to be and to look a very straight sort of a person. Though bringing your mother to Government House at the age of 42 might not have been quite as surreptitious as I could have been if only I'd turned my mind to the matter. But my mother thought it was wonderful. It was the only Government House she'd ever been in. She bought a very special dress, which to the end of her life she never wore again. It was a most beautiful dress, and Sir James treated her like a princess. He treated her with the greatest affection and respect, and she never forgot it. He showed her around the botanical gardens nearby. Now that was a very dangerous thing to do to my mother, because she was a very ardent gardener, and she went around the gardens with a pair of secateurs. And she said, "You don't mind if I take a little cutting at this?" And he said, "I'm looking the other way, Mrs. Kirby." And so the family home in Concord in Sydney is still graced by a large set of clippings, which, as I leave Hobart later tonight, I will of course declare to the quarantine service, which is in operation at the airport. I do promise you that I haven't gone around Government House today or the Botanical Gardens, but only because the Vice-Chancellor of this university, who has been very well trained in the habits of North Korea, has made sure that I spent the whole day giving speech after speech. I think, if I can suggest it, he too has been trained in the school of Sir James Plimsoll, and I can't mean to give him any higher compliment than that. The Commission of Inquiry on North Korea is, in a sense, an outgrowth of the war which broke out on the Korean Peninsula in June 1950 and lasted until 1953. Sir James Plimsoll, then Mr. Plimsoll, had reason to know about that war because he was appointed to a commission, a United Nations commission, which was concerned with the long-term objective of peace and reunification of the Korean Peninsula. The line drawn on the map across the centre of Korea is a wholly artificial line. It was actually drawn by a middle-ranking official of the Department of State in Washington and by name Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk later became the Secretary of State of the United States for President Truman. And he was told the Allies are dividing the Korean Peninsula as they divided Germany and Austria into spheres of influence, and you have to draw the line, do it roughly in the middle. So he went and drew the line across the middle. The war broke out. When the war broke out, the Soviet Union had left the Security Council in protest against the fact that the Western powers had not agreed that the People's Republic of China, freshly installed in the government of China, should assume the China seat in the Security Council. And for that reason, the Soviet Union, looking back on it, perhaps justifiably, walked out, absented itself from the Security Council, and when the war broke out, there was no Russian veto to be exercised against the establishment of a United Nations force, which was to react to the invasion by the North into the South. The war was particularly ferocious. Very large numbers of both Korean communities were killed. Very large numbers of American soldiers were killed and captured. Very large numbers of Australian soldiers were killed. In the main street of Seoul, in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, are the flags in the very most important part of the street of all of the Allied powers that fought under the flag of the United Nations for the liberation of South Korea from the invasion of the North, one of which flags is our own, the Australian flag, because they don't forget that we were part of the UN force that ultimately drove back the invading North, that then had to retreat when the Chinese volunteers came to the aid of the North, and ultimately the demarcation line was settled by an armistice. It's probably the most heavily guarded border in the whole planet, and it was settled roughly at where it had been when this cruel war broke out. And behind that demarcation line grew a regime First, under a charismatic figure named Kim Il-sung. Second, under his son, Kim Jong-il. And now under the third Supreme Leader, Kim Jong-un. These three Supreme Leaders have operated a regime which is extremely secretive, which doesn't encourage visitors, that allows some tourism but only on the condition that you are under constant surveillance and you have to go and you cannot talk to the people, you can't go and check up on anything. They control the sources of news, not only to the world but also to their own people. For various reasons, the state of affairs in North Korea came increasingly to concern the international community. I think it's probably fair to say that it was when, after the policies of Kim Dae-jung, a genuine human rights hero and president of South Korea, when the advantage was taken of his so-called sunshine policy to reach out to North Korea, advantage was taken to develop a nuclear capability, to develop reportedly 20 nuclear warheads and sophisticated missile delivery systems that could deliver these warheads to South Korea, to Japan, and for that matter, into North Korea itself and into China and into Russia. That's when the world started to take the position of North Korea and its human rights more seriously. In May 2013, the Human Rights Council, which is the highest human rights body of the United Nations, decided to establish a commission of inquiry. There had for 6 years been a special rapporteur on North Korea, but North Korea would have nothing to do with him, would never let him come into their country, would not communicate with him, and so the Human Rights Council ratcheted up the response of the United Nations to establish a commission of inquiry. This is a very serious step for the Human Rights Council to take. And the Human Rights Council's commission of inquiry was adopted without a vote. It remains the only commission of inquiry of the United Nations that has ever been created without a call for a vote. 3 times the president of the commission of the council paused to allow a vote to be called for, but the call came there not, because the international community was becoming deeply concerned about human rights and determined that something should be done to investigate and to get the best possible information to the international community. I was appointed in May 2013, along with the Special Rapporteur, whose name is Marzuki Darusman, a former Attorney General of Indonesia, and along with Sonia Basurko, who is an expert in genocide, coming from her experience involving in human rights in Serbia, her country. And accordingly, we 3 became the Commission of Inquiry. We set to work immediately. We were given until March of 2014 to deliver our report, and we brought our report in within budget, on time and unanimously, and if I can say so, unlike many United Nations documents, it is readable. And that is a very important feature of the report, because I think it is not only readable, it has been read, and that has attracted a lot of attention to what we found. The mandate of the Commission of Inquiry required us to address the various matters that had been complained about. The detention camps. North Korea says there are no detention camps. The inability to move about the country, the total inability to move overseas. The lack of access to information. There is no access to the internet except for the elite in North Korea. The food situation. During a famine in the mid-1990s, at least 1 million people of North Korea, with a population the same as Australia, 23 million, 1 million people perished for lack of food at the very time that great amounts of expenditure were being incurred in developing the nuclear program. The impact on women, the impact on people of religion, the impact on people of different political philosophy, the so-called Songbun system, which is a system that classifies everyone in society into 50 categories, essentially 3: those who are hostile to the regime, those who are wavering about the regime, and those who are core, or people who are regarded as the friends of the regime. The core is small, the hostile is significant, the wavering are what they think of the majority of their population. And finally, we were asked to report on abductions. The cases of abductions first of the Korean civilians who were seized as the forces moved back into North Korea. Anybody, mostly males of about 20 to 30, were seized, particularly if they had any employment skill. Just taken away, never heard of again. Families begged to be informed. Are they at least alive? No communication, no mail, no telephone, no internet, no Skype, no contact. But abductions also included a significant number from foreign countries, countries such as Japan. Young school children on their way home from badminton practice were seized and put onto fishing vessels whilst their parents waited for them to return home, desperately phoning around to find out where their child has gone, and it turns out years later they found the child was seized, taken to North Korea, seemingly for a reason so insignificant as to teach skills in language and the latest idiom in the Japanese language for the members of the spy agencies and other public activities of North Korea. So that was our mandate, and we faced the difficulty that we knew we would never be allowed into North Korea. If they don't allow peaceful tourists to have free access, we would not be allowed. But eventually we decided, we three, the commissioners, that we would breach that wall by gaining access partly through satellites and the images that are now available to look through Google Earth and defence satellites at great detail in the country itself, but partly by getting people who have fled North Korea to come and speak to us. So we advertised, and we had no problem getting witnesses. In South Korea, there are 26,000 people who have fled the tyranny in North Korea, and they began to come forward in great numbers. In the end, we had to cut them off because we otherwise would not have been able to finish our report by the time appointed. And so we decided if their technique is to allow nobody access to them, we will allow the world access to the reality about them. And so our public hearings were filmed, they were put up on the web. You can go home tonight and Google North Korea, United Nations Commission of Inquiry, and there it is, hour after hour of the people giving their humble stories about their terrible situation and what had caused them to flee North Korea. North Korea says that they are scum, human scum, who have left the fatherland, but their stories give very quiet, reflective, respectful, not aggressive statements about what happened to them and why they took the tremendously perilous step of trying to leave North Korea, some of them repeatedly until they got away. We don't have the time tonight to go into all of the matters in our report. The report was delivered First of all, by making it public. This is the process. That was done on the 17th of February 2014. It was then delivered to the Human Rights Council on the 17th of March 2014. That council then proceeded to debate the report. North Korea came forward and said this is totally unacceptable, lies by human scum, you can't believe them, they're a self-selecting group of people. So we said, have a look yourself. Have a look yourself. You can decide if you think they're telling falsehoods, if they are human scum. Obviously, most of the members of the United Nations in the Human Rights Council agreed with us. At the end, a vote was taken on a resolution to follow up and take action on our report, and unusually, a very strong vote came in favour of the report of 30 of the member countries of the Human Rights Council. Only 6 countries voted against. The countries which once would support North Korea had begun to fall away because the evidence was so powerful and overwhelming. The countries of the 6 were the Russian Federation, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Pakistan, and one other country in Asia, which I'll recall shortly. Oh, Venezuela. So it was six countries. And the rest of the Human Rights Council either abstained, as 10 did. India, the greatest democracy on earth, abstained. How can you abstain? South Africa, the land of Nelson Mandela, abstained. The only arguments that were advanced by the 6 were not specific criticisms of any of our methodology or of our findings, but simply the statement, we do not believe in country-specific inquiries. We do not think that is a correct methodology. But once the council had decided to have the inquiry, and once you have the report, to take the view that you'll just ignore the report and you'll ignore all the evidence that's been collected because you don't agree with inquiries, is effectively to give every tyrannous country on earth a veto in respect of human rights investigations, which is not the scheme of the Charter of the United Nations. There is a veto in the United Nations, but it's confined to the Security Council, it's confined to 5 countries only, and it's confined to the jurisdiction of the Security Council, which is international peace and security. Matters of human rights are the responsibility of other organs of the United Nations, and there are no vetoes. And at that point, a very interesting development happened. The members of the Security Council became very interested in the report of the Commission of Inquiry. And we were immediately asked to come to New York to give a so-called ARIA briefing to the members of the Security Council. This was not to a formal meeting of the Security Council, which would possibly run into a veto as to what took place in it, but it's to give a briefing. And any country that's a member of the Security Council can ask for a briefing. Interestingly, the country that took the initiative for the briefing was France, the French Republic. They said, we so disapprove of this country, we will not have an embassy there. And they don't have an embassy there. There's a British embassy there, and it fell to the unfortunate duty of the British ambassador to have to present the report of the Commission of Inquiry on behalf of the European Union to the Foreign Minister of North Korea. I invite our distinguished colleagues and former colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to speculate in their mind what that encounter would be like when their duty was to present the report across the table and the business of North Korea was to push the report back and not to receive it. What would happen to it at the end if the ambassador got up and just left it standing there? I think probably a minor functionary would take it and say, I think you forgot this document. But anyway, the briefing went ahead. Australia became a sponsor for the briefing because, as you know, Australia at the moment is a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and Ambassador Quinlan has been taking a very leading part in this, and the United States of America became the other briefer. We were told that China was going around the United Nations building lobbying against the participation of members of the Security Council in the briefing, but in the result only 2 countries did not attend. The seats were lined. It wasn't in the actual chamber of the Security Council, but in a very large General Assembly room which was packed to the rafters. The seats were aligned with the 15 seats of the Security Council. There were 2 empty seats in alphabetical order according to the English language, China and the Russian Federation, but every other seat was occupied. Every other member of the Security Council turned up, another indication of the fact that the world is deeply concerned about this. And of the 13, 11 spoke, and of the 11 who spoke, 9 supported the recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry that the case of North Korea should be referred to the International Criminal Court to render accountable North Korea for the crimes if the International Criminal Court should find them guilty, as we believe there was evidence to support of the crime of crimes against humanity, a very important and serious international crime. When the report was completed, it fell to me to write a letter delivering it by electronic means in the first instance, and then through the mission in Geneva to the Supreme Leader. And so a letter was addressed to Kim Jong-un, and in the letter I attached our report and said that we had found serious, reasonable grounds for finding that there were crimes against humanity, and that it was the duty of any person with the capacity to do so to prevent crimes against humanity, to provide remedies to them, and that in due course these matters might come before a tribunal of the international community, and that investigation might concern the officials of North Korea, comma, including possibly yourself, comma. I was criticised, the Commission of Inquiry was criticised for writing those words by some, shall we say, professional diplomats and formalists, but if we had not done that, if we had been of the opinion, as we were, that there were crimes against humanity and that he might one day be rendered accountable for it, and in delivering it we had not called that matter to his notice, then that would be a breach of the principle of due process of law, because we were holding back something and not stating it candidly and frankly to him, as was our duty. So I'm unapologetic, and we put him on notice. Now at that moment things started to change. Things have really started to change, and they've even been changing in the last week, as you may have noticed. What happened? Something happened and is happening in North Korea that has resulted in a change of pace. It's what I called yesterday on the BBC a certain charm offensive. We are in the middle of a charm offensive from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. First of all, they began the process of reopening the Kaesong industrial complex, which is a joint industrial complex. Secondly, having cancelled it several times, they again opened the process of family reunion. This sounds a very grand and humane and kindly thing. It's crumbs. They have a ballot, they have a cruel lottery where hundreds and hundreds of South Koreans ask and beg to have the chance of seeing their family for an hour. And they ultimately select 80 families to have this reunion for a very short time. How people can be so cruel to families that are separated and have been for 50 or 60 years, have lost contact and know the families are all growing older and they may not have another chance. They have to hold out for these crumbs of 80 positions. But it was reopened and it was happened again, and we went through the charade of the grieving and tearful families, and it was said to be an act of great humanity of the Supreme Leader. But then something even more dramatic happened. They've introduced in the Human Rights Council a system whereby every country is subject to what is called universal periodic review. This is a review of the human rights record of each and every country, Australia included. We are criticised regularly. We were criticised recently about our position on Sri Lanka. We've been criticised and will continue to be criticised. But we have to sit there, cop it, give a statement, our answer as best we can, and every country is subject to this, including North Korea. Last year, or the year before last, they went through their first tranche of universal periodic review. 167 recommendations were made for improvement in their human rights record, and they accepted not a single one. They were the first country in the whole world to say their human rights situation was so unblemished that they couldn't agree to a single one of the recommendations. But then this year, after the report of the Commission of Inquiry, something happened, because North Korea appeared on the second tranche of their universal periodic review, and they announced that they had evolved in their position, and they now accepted that of the 167 there are 80 where they are prepared to concede that by the standards of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international treaties, many of which they have signed, they have to look into it and improve their human rights. That is the first time they have really engaged with the human rights system. They have refused to engage with the Special Rapporteur. They have not allowed him into their country. They have refused to invite the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come to their country. They have declined aid and assistance that could help them improve their human rights record, but at least they were beginning to engage with the Universal Periodic Review system. And so North Korea took these steps, but they then began to talk of their own human rights report. They said, we are going to deliver our own report on our human rights, and we tell you it will be a rosy report. Well, the report came out on the 13th of September, and it's true, it is a rosy report. But I'm going to give you just a few paragraphs. There isn't time tonight to go through them all, but this is what I would call breaking news, because all of this is happening even as we speak. I mean, this is just a matter of weeks this has come forward. So the report, report of the rosy report of North Korea on their own human rights is about 90 pages long, and it's, if I can say so humbly, it's not as readable as the report of the Commission of Inquiry. It is written in the language, how shall I put this without offending the bureaucrats here, if there are any. It's very bureaucratic, and you'll just get a little bit of a glimpse about this. Here we go, just a few paragraphs. The US and Western countries misuse universality of human rights standards established in the international human rights instruments, and they are going to endless lengths in their manoeuvres to force their human rights standards upon other countries as they did before. These countries make the rumour afloat that their human rights standards are the fair standards, the best standards, but they are reactionary ones, applied in the imperialist way of thinking with a view of value and way of life which look down on, oppress and dominate others. It was proved vividly that the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, attempted to bring down the DPRK, that's North Korea, by collecting the prejudiced data without any scientific accuracy and objectivity in the content, and raising the publication of its so-called report, an invention which is extreme in the selectivity and double-dealing of its standards. The South Korean authorities, it goes on, are going mad to defame the dignity and system of the DPRK, taking part in the US smear campaign against North Korea's human rights. The intelligence service and all the plot-breeding organisations guide the people to South Korea and bribe them to talk evil about North Korea in the international arena. They also play the role of witness in the slanderous propaganda, completely forgetting that these are the people who committed crimes in the DPRK and fled to other countries, leaving their family. The South Korean authorities used the dirty and worthless human scums as the witness in fabricating the anti-DPRK human rights report and instigating them to slander the socialist system of the DPRK in parliaments and debates held in the US, UK, Switzerland, etc. Furthermore, they make films and publish books full of testimony made by these scums. So obviously someone up there is beginning to look at the Google and where they have access to the internet, to look at the record of what these people are saying about the homeland. Each nation applies international human rights conventions based on its approval and ratification of the convention. However, provisions set forth in the convention should not be applied without consideration, as the situation, condition and standard of human rights varies according to each country. It is necessary to consider, mark these words, it is necessary to consider the will and requirement of the country concerned in interpreting and applying the international human rights standards. The will and intention of and requirement of the country concerned. This is to say, we may live in the age of the Charter, we may live in the age of the United Nations, we may live in the age of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt and her famous committee, and we may live in the age of international treaties which we've all joined together and signed because of the horror we felt after the Second World War, when we learned how dreadful was the treatment by totalitarian regimes, and committed ourselves to a world of universal human rights. But at the bottom line, it's necessary to consider the will and requirement. Those two words, strong words, will and requirement of North Korea, before you consider the application of any international principles to them. I could go on reading, they're very interesting. I ask you to put aside the rather old-fashioned, stilted and semi-Soviet language of the report. I think, in fairness, this may be because they don't have much contact with the international world, and especially the English-speaking world. And therefore, you've got to look beyond the fact that the language is stilted and unreadable and difficult, and just look at the substance of it. But the bottom line substance is, we are happy to be a member of the international community so long as we can develop our nuclear warheads outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to the great peril and danger both of the world that might be affected by our warheads, and to the peril and danger of a world in which any country can have nuclear weapons uncontrolled. Will our species survive if that becomes our world? That is the real question. if it becomes the world in the hands of totalitarian countries like North Korea. It must be a very doubtful thing that our species will survive if that is what is to happen. But put aside the language, put aside the stilted, at least what has happened is they have begun to try to advance their case. They have begun to try to join in the debate. And over the last week, two very interesting developments happened. This is really breaking news. This is not a Plimsoll lecture which is set in stone that I'm standing here before you just reading. This is things that are happening today, yesterday. What has happened in the last week is that the second highest official of North Korea went to the Asian Games. I believe his visit was unexpected. He is the political officer of the Korean People's Army. He is a man very high in the administration and power of North Korea. He possibly would have been the third highest, except that, as you will remember, in December last year, the uncle of the Supreme Leader, having been thought to have shown insufficient deference to the Supreme Leader and also to be advancing the suggestion that North Korea should go the way of China, keeping the party's role but changing the role of the economy and allowing liberalisation of the economy. That was apparently, that or something else was not accepted, and in a most un-Asian way he was seized in a Politburo meeting, dragged under the lights of the international cameras, put before a court where the judges are reported in the North Korean media to be screaming at him that he was worse than a dog and a treacherous viper, and then within 2 days came the report that he had been executed by firing squad. That is the way this country resolves disputes about matters of high policy. There may be politicians on both sides in Australia who think that is not such a bad system, that it's, shall we say, it's a very swift way of resolving differences. But fortunately, the law is above them, and that can't be done here. But in North Korea, that is what happened. But then in the last few days, apart from the visit of this very high official who met the Prime Minister, the second highest official in the Republic of Korea, and they've agreed to come together later in the year for meetings, which will be the first high-level meetings between North and South Korea in 5 years. So it's a very significant step. But today, or yesterday, came the news that in North Korea, the officials for the government had admitted for the first time that there are labour camps. They've always denied that there are camps. They've always said this is total falsehood. But our report reproduced satellite images. You can't hide anywhere in this world today, absolutely. Satellite images, even ordinary old Google Earth. The witnesses came before us and gave very precise locations about the relationship between where the camps are and where the nearest town is. And so you can just go there, and they're given the accurate descriptors are there, and you can go and have a look, and everything that the witnesses said about the layout and format, the barracks, the staff canteens, the lack of food, the incinerators for the bodies, all of that is accounted and explained. But also yesterday, they announced that for the first time they are going to have talks with the European Union, the successors to all those officials that Sir James Plimsoll introduced me to back in the 1970s, about human rights in their country. And that is something they have never agreed to do before. These are new developments. As well as that, we have the very curious phenomenon of the absence for the past nearly 4 weeks of the Supreme Leader, who is normally on the television even more than politicians are in our country. He is the star, he is the celebrity, the greatest celebrity, and suddenly he's disappeared, so that we don't quite know what all of this means. But I'm not saying to you that all of these things flow from the report of a Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations. That would be foolish. But the fact is that the report will go from the Human Rights Council to the General Assembly of the United Nations in October, November. And it will, if our recommendation is accepted, it will go from the General Assembly of the United Nations to the Security Council of the United Nations in November, December. And it may just be that the timing of these developments in North Korea may be connected with that timetable, because one can understand that countries might say, well, whilst progress is being made, we should allow it to continue to be made. But the real question for the international community and the officials and the bureaucrats and the diplomats will be, is this real progress, or is this simply an appearance in the face of the likelihood that these matters will be coming before the highest organs of the United Nations in the next few weeks? The final thing I can say is, when I was a little boy at North Strathfield Public School in Sydney, I received a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every school child, in public schools at least in Australia, got them. They were printed on airmail paper, which was very curious to a boy in 1949, because airmail paper was very scarce in the post-war reconstruction. But we received that, and I got into my brain, because we were taught about it. It'd be a good thing if Australian school children were again taught about the Universal Declaration. I was taught that we'd just gone through a great and terrible war where so many people had been killed, and after which we discovered the most horrible, horrible events affecting innocent civilian people on all continents, and that we must never do this again, otherwise that dreadful bomb, which is still burned into my imagination because of my age, will see the end of our planet and our loved ones and our world with all of its beauties. And so that was where I grew up, and that was how I always have approached the United Nations, as I believe Sir James Plimsoll did, with a sense of optimism and a sense of honour, believing that out of that terrible sacrifice, which, by the way, I saw today when I spoke at the Hobart Town Hall. You go in there next time you're passing by, just have a look. In this little state, you look at the numbers of people who fought and the numbers who died in the First World War. It is horrendous. We'd been through that twice. We didn't want to go through it again, and we realised that unless we attended to universal human rights and stopped the genocides and the crimes against humanity, then our future would not be safe. And so I have to tell you, as a citizen to other citizens, that the United Nations is an organisation which, when you work for it, can drive you mad. It is sometimes very irritating. Example, they have a rule that if you want to change your air ticket, you have to give 16 days notice, when the whole purpose of the change may be that you want to go tomorrow. So they have, it's a big organisation, it has to have auditors and so on, but it can drive you crazy. But on the Commission of Inquiry on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, this is an instance where the United Nations has operated exactly as it should. It is operated under the Charter. It has sought to uphold, in accordance with the institutions, the rules of universal human rights. It has been faithful to that little book on airmail paper that I received at the age of 9. And we have to hope, as citizens of a free country, that we will see the international law and the development of international human rights, and that they will ultimately lift the cloud that has settled on North Korea. Thank you all very much. Yeah.
Michael is happy to take a couple of questions if anyone has them, and there are a couple of roving microphones at the back. There's one here.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk on North Korea. I would just say that to some extent both the USA and Russia have been guilty of removing people when it suited their purpose. However, my question to you is, do you not think that one of the most important human rights that we can afford this planet will be on the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War next year, that perhaps we remove the vetoes from the 5 permanent members who perhaps no longer should hold those vetoes if we are to truly have human rights on the planet?
Well, I do agree with you in your comment about the Soviet Union, the United States, and I'd add a few others as well. You know, let's be frank. And in my written paper, I have conceded that in the Rosie report, there are sections in the report which are fair comment. They, for example, comment on the human rights of Guantanamo Bay. Now, I don't want to get into comments against the United States of America because it is a rights-respecting and rule of law country. But how that can have continued for so long, especially when President Obama said he would finish it, and it's still in operation. I mean, there are fair comments critical of Western countries. And we all know as Australian citizens, they could write a few fair comments about us. And we don't have to go into what they'd be about, but we know we are not blameless. So I think your first point is a fair point, but it doesn't divert us, it mustn't divert us from addressing the issue we were asked to address. Have there been violations of human rights? Can you identify who is responsible? And do any of them rise to the level of genocide or crimes against humanity? Our answer to those questions were, yes, there have been serious violations. Yes, some of them do rise to the level of crimes against humanity. No, they have not been shown to have a reasonable case to answer on genocide. That is because genocide is defined in the Genocide Convention as being the killing of a population or part of a population on the grounds of race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. These are all post-World War II reasons. They don't include politics or social view. And in North Korea, they're not killing people because of their race. They're killing them because of their political affiliation or suspected affiliation. Now, as to the veto, when I was in Washington, we had public hearings in Washington. So I asked if I could see Dumbarton Oaks. Dumbarton Oaks is in Georgetown, on the outskirts of the centre of Washington, and it's a place of mansions. And it was a very large mansion building of a multi-millionaire who made it available in 1945 to the leaders who were drafting the Charter of the United Nations. And Dr. H.V. Evatt, the Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs, External Affairs, was there as part of the negotiation, and he was against the veto. But, of course, the Soviet Union and the United States were strongly for it, and you'll remember the United States had not joined the League. It had rejected the League covenant. And this being the case, the question was, how could we get an international organisation which would include these mighty superpowers? And the plain fact is we wouldn't have got it at all if we hadn't had them in. And once they're in on that condition, they will not agree to the removal of the veto. My own view about this is that, in a way, this is reflecting the power relationships of 1945, but insofar as it still refers to the nuclear powers, those who are lawfully nuclear powers under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is recognising that there are some superpowers. And as well as that, it is recognising the reality that it's not going to change without their consent. So that my own position would be that if that was the price for getting a United Nations, then it has been a price worth paying. The interesting feature is the voting, the use of the veto. The use is so different. The biggest user was the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. The smallest user is China. It is not the Chinese way of doing international law to use the veto. So that we can't be sure what is going to happen in the months ahead, but I wouldn't at all count out the possibility that the Security Council, as it did with MH17 in the matter of Ukraine, which is a matter very close to the deepest geopolitical concerns of Russia, they still were able, with, let it be said, a very, very good role played by our Minister, Julie Bishop. They were able to get a resolution through the Security Council. Now, North Korea is more difficult than MH17, but you get people into a room with a problem and there is a sort of momentum to try to find an answer, and I'm hoping that that will be so in the case of North Korea. And I think maybe they think it might be so in the case of North Korea. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Here's a microphone coming.
It's a question and a comment in two parts. What you're asking for is the second time to have a country that's not party to the Rome Statute make a decision to refer another country that's not part of the Rome Statute off to the ICC. But this time around, unlike Libya, you face the real prospect of a veto. If you've already seen China and Russia stand back from the work of your committee when you came before the Security Council earlier this year, what's your plan B for when it may again suffer the trouble? And my other question, which is more important, is what's your comment about having, for example, the United States referring countries to the ICC when they themselves aren't bound by the ICC? Because I find that quite troubling.
Well, these are fair questions. Vice-Chancellor, this is like Q&A on the ABC. It's worse. It's
far more civilised.
Well, first of all, in terms of the what is my plan B, I don't have any plan B. That's not my role. My role was to be a commission of inquiry. We have conducted the inquiry. We have found our findings. We have reported them to the organs of the United Nations. And I am not a diplomat. Some people said, couldn't you have expressed it a bit more diplomatically, not being quite so blunt and frank about the situation of cruel, inhumane treatment of hundreds of thousands of people? No, that's not my role. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not trained as a diplomat. There are people who spent their whole life, like Sir James, being trained to be diplomats. But my job was just to report. Now it will be a matter for the international community to try to find a solution. I'm not at all counting out the possibility that a solution will be found. It may not ultimately be, it may be, I hope it is, it may not be the International Criminal Court. We, in the report of the Commission of Inquiry, set out a number of options, one of which was a special tribunal, like the Yugoslavia Tribunal, one of which was a joint tribunal of some post-change in the situation, Korean tribunal. But we also recommended that there should be set up a field station in South Korea to gather the testimony which we had begun to gather. And that has been agreed. South Korea has agreed to do that. That's heavily criticised in the Rosie report, but that has been done. And that will continue to be done. One of the most interesting things about this job was when we delivered our report, I was surrounded not by the diplomats of the United Kingdom and Australia and so on, but by the diplomats of the former Soviet bloc. They all came up to us and said, never believe that if you do not get immediate outcomes, that your time has been wasted. What you have done has been extremely important for the people of Korea, for all the people of Korea, because in due course this will be part of their history and it will affirm the suffering. In a way, even providing the forum of our public hearings and allowing in this very low-key way these people who have suffered so greatly to come forward and affirm their humanity by saying, we do not accept this. We are Koreans, but we do not accept that we just have to put up with this tyrannous, totalitarian cruelty. And if we've done nothing else than allow these voices to be spoken, I believe that ultimately a rational world will respond. And I may be wrong, but I think, and I believe Sir James Plimsoll thought, our world is basically programmed, our species is programmed to search for rationality. We're not always given to rationality, but when we don't see it, we think things are out of harmony. We want them brought back into harmony. So it was very interesting to see the ambassador for Albania, the ambassador for the Czech Republic, and the ambassador for Kazakhstan coming up and telling us these things. And these countries voted for action. So the world does change, and we've got to have confidence that we can help to change the world where there is irrational, cruel crimes against humanity.
Well, I have one last question.
So do you feel optimistic, say that in 20 years' time, that when you think about what you've just said, that you think the change can happen, do you think it will happen from within, or, when 20 years' time, 50 years' time, do you feel optimistic?
Professor Victor Cha, who was President George W. Bush's advisor on Korean matters, has written a very interesting book. I think it's called The Failed State. And in it, he finishes the book with two sentences. If in 20 years North Korea no longer exists, I will not be surprised. If in 20 years North Korea still exists, I will not be surprised. We had to be quite careful. We never said that the only way to solve this is to have regime change, because they are a member of the United Nations. They are a signed-up member of the Charter. We were an organ of the United Nations. It wasn't our role to say, well, we've got to get rid of the Kims and change the politics. We were respectful. We always dealt with them correctly. We communicated with them. We gave them every chance. Over and over again, we invited them to participate and to respond, but they didn't do so. Now, suddenly, there is this sudden flow of actions. And almost every day now, something is being done. Some engagement is happening. Now, this is not a bad thing. Anything that gets a hermit state to become even a semi-engaged state. If you had been advising, say if I were a member of McKinsey's, I would have said to North Korea, you've got to give your Rosie report to us, and we will write your Rosie report. And it's going to cost you a few $1 million, but it will be expressed in the most beautiful English. It will have lots of footnotes, and it will refer to lots of material that can obfuscate the issues. Their Rosie report doesn't do that. And therefore you have to, as it were, say, what would they say if they could have the chance to answer that 27% of all neonates, 1 to 5, in North Korea are stunted. That means they've been born and their mothers have not been properly nourished. The child has not been nourished in the womb and is not nourished in the first years of life. That is very bad news for the human brain. The brain at those critical years needs nourishment to expand. It's a very critical and fast-moving organism. And if you don't have it, you have what we now see in the Netherlands. My partner is from the Netherlands. You see in the Netherlands that because in those last years, especially the last year of the Second World War, they didn't have access to proper food. Dementia is very high in those who were above the rivers, who didn't get access to the food, who were not liberated early. And that is what's going to happen to these little babies and young kids in North Korea. So what would they say? Why? How can they justify the atomic weapons in one of the most impoverished countries on earth? How can they justify not allowing the World Food Programme to have access to monitors who could see that they were giving their food as required to those who are most needy, not to the elite? Everyone who receives help under the World Food Programme does that, but not North Korea. And their population suffered, and at least 1 million starved to death. So these are the realities, and that's why when you ask a question, should we just try to find a way of accommodating, I say yes, and I welcome engagement, but there has to be acknowledgement and there has to be accountability. Those who are guilty of crimes against humanity, some must be rendered accountable, because unless that happens, we keep on committing crimes against humanity. And it's not a good look, the world at the moment, and we've got to try to bring it back into the world of the law and the charter, and that's basically what I was trying to do.
And
Any other questions?
I think a wonderful note to finish the evening on, if that's all right. We will have a chance afterwards to continue the conversation.
I think you have the call.
Huh?
I hope I'm not overriding a Vice-Chancellor.
You're doing exactly what academics always do.
Thank you. Your comments about brain health and mental health have prompted me to ask a question about the plight of children who are in detention camps in Australia. And I'm wondering if any of the methodology that you've described that seems to be bearing some early fruit could be relevant to the way we deal with that problem.
Well, on the High Court of Australia, we had a case concerning children in detention. The case is a reported decision. It is the case of the Minister for Immigration and B, capital B. And the case concerned whether or not the Migration Act 1958 of Australia allowed detention of children. And a judge of the family court held no, because the Act did not specifically provide for children detention, and if Parliament was going to do this, which would be bringing Australia into conflict with the requirement of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that no child will be kept in detention except by authority of law and for the shortest possible time, that Parliament would have done it explicitly. So that was the argument that the judge accepted. That then went on appeal to the full court of the family court, and by 2-1, the full court of the family court upheld that judge and said it was not lawful under the Act of Parliament. That then came to the High Court of Australia, and I was a member of the High Court for that case. Now, anyone who has read my decisions as a judge would know that it wouldn't have taken much to persuade me that the judge was right and that Parliament had not specifically provided it. And that's how I went into the case. I went in, but then two arguments were mounted. The first was that when the matter had been going through Parliament, the government of the day, which, let me say, was the Labor government, it was Mr. Hand, the Minister for Immigration, when it was going through, it was called to the notice of our Parliament by the officials of the Attorney General's Department, to their eternal credit, that if we enact this, we will be in breach of our obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it could not be said that our Parliament did not know that it was possibly going to be in breach of the Convention. But the second problem was even more difficult. It was that there was a provision in the Act that related to how you were to examine a child in detention. It was a detailed provision relating to how you would search a child in detention. And it was impossible to reconcile that provision with the notion that the child should not be in detention. And it showed that some attention had been given specifically to the fact that children were in detention. And so at the end of the case, I could not agree with the decision of the family court, and I had to join all of the members of the court in holding that detention of children and of all people is required under our system of migration. It wasn't a very pleasant thing to have to do, but in the courts, our job is to find what the law means. It's not to say what we think, hang the law. We'll just say what we think should be done. And that's the rule of law. That's how we operate. Now, that doesn't mean it should stay that way forever. And it's always open. And I think there's been debate on both sides of politics that whatever we do to knowing adults who come to the country we shouldn't do that to children, because children need education, interaction, and love and care and all the other things that I got and that most of you got, and that is a human right. It should be changed, it can be changed, but until we somehow get politicians on both sides to suddenly say we are not going to try to make politics out of desperate refugee type situations, but we're going to process them according to the Convention, and we're not going to send them, if you're Labor, to Malaysia, and we're not going to send them, if you're Coalition, to Cambodia. We're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to do it as the Refugees Convention contemplates. And where our numbers are nothing like the numbers of Italy and France and even Britain. Our numbers are tiny, but there's something about living on an island. You Tasmanians would know it. We Australians know it. if you live on an island, there's all those people out there. They're beyond your island, and they're trying to get on your island. And that makes it a very difficult political sell. But somehow we've got to try to address this as a nation because of our moral and ethical principles, and also because of our universal human rights and our treaty obligations. Okay, well, Vice-Chancellor, have we had enough?
Well, are we allowed to stop? There are times when you get to see a master at work, and the best thing you can do is just sit back and appreciate what it is that you're seeing. Michael, I thought that was awesome. It wasn't without fault. You may recall that very early on in his speech, Michael started by drawing parallels between North Korea and the University of Tasmania. As the talk proceeded, I actually was increasingly convinced that we're extraordinarily fortunate to live right here. Those of you who ever happen to be in Washington with a spare moment on your hands, the Korean War Memorial there is well and truly worth a visit. It's awesome in the way that it displays the horror of the war, the magnitude of the human losses. It covers something like half an acre. It has a series of United Nations soldiers, life-size. They're all wearing greatcoats, which would at that time, of course, have been made of Australian wool, but it's well and truly worth having a look at. On that note, can I ask Peter Boyce to come up for the vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, votes of thanks can be very anticlimactic, especially in the wake of a uniquely authoritative presentation on a topic that has frustrated Western governments and humanitarian activists across the world for more than 60 years. Now, political scientists have not yet formulated a precise or universally accepted definition of a pariah state. There would be widespread agreement, I think, however, that North Korea is probably the benchmark for pariah status, although I doubt very much whether Michael Kirby would have used that word in drafting his report. Michael has canvassed the possibilities of bringing this reclusive and often impenetrable pariah to full account. And we will hope and pray that governments and international agencies will eventually prove persuasive to his arguments and the strength of his Commission report. In thanking Michael for shedding light on a truly tragic impasse, and in drawing this meeting to a close, it is sobering that we recall again that one of Sir James Plimsoll's earliest diplomatic assignments was in Korea, following the North's unprovoked invasion of the South in June 1950. There was incidentally at the time some doubt as to whether the North did invade the South, and I can remember as a youngster asking Sir James whether it was really true that the North initiated the invasion. I feel rather guilty that I even had any doubts, harboured any doubts at that time. 64 years on, nothing much seems to have changed, except the encouraging signs that Michael Kirby referred to in his closing remarks, and we hope that they'll be followed through. But I do know that Sir James would have approved the choice of Michael Kirby as tonight's speaker, and would have approved our speaker's choice of his topic. Would you please join me in thanking him again?